But our next presentation is caught in Entangled Frontiers, re-evaluating the boundaries of museum collections, the case of the Polynesian feather headdresses by Dr. Maia Nuku. Dr. Nuku was appointed as the Associate Curator of Oceanic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in November 2014. This appointment made her the first ever Indigenous Pacific person to be made a curator at the Met. She is currently a researcher on the European Research Council funded project Pacific Presences, Oceanic Art and European Museums, investigating the Pacific collections of a series of European institutions. The purpose of this research is to explore materiality and cross-cultural histories in the context of present-day museum policy and practice, working with partner institutions in the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Russia. Her research is invigorated by a series of collaborations with artists and scholars from the Pacific, whose engagement with the collections plays a vital part in reassessing the dynamic and varied legacies of the early encounters between Europe and the Pacific. Her dissertation focused on collections by missionaries of wrapped and bound god images, and she continues to investigate cosmological aspects of collections often lost in the historic and museological record. Please welcome Dr. Nuku to the stage.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tainui te waka, ko kapuarangi te maunga, ko wainui te awa, ko tōrere nui ārua te tipuna, ko manakiao te tangata, ko ngaitai te iwi, ko Maia Nuku ahau. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to come and speak this afternoon. And yes, congratulations, Sean, on a fabulous exhibition. I really enjoyed spending some time up there when we were up there together in the galleries before lunch. Caught in Entangled Frontiers, re-evaluating the boundaries of museum collections, the case of the Polynesian feather headdresses. I wanted to push back the notion of frontier shores and take us a little further back in time to the late 18th century and early 19th century, to a body of works created in Polynesia, feather headdresses. And this is really picking up on a body of research that I was doing and, with the Pacific Presences research project at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. So the earliest exchanges between Polynesian islanders and Europeans involved artifacts incorporating feathers and human hair. Manuscript journals from Pedro de Quiros's 17th century expedition to the Pacific recount fraught yet intriguing exchanges between the Spanish crew members and the cacique, or chief, of the island of Hao, in present-day Tuamotu archipelago. Entries for the 11th of February 1606 note a robust, tall, and well-proportioned native presenting the sergeant, Pedro Garcia, with a turban of feathers, explaining that in amongst the many feathers were tresses of a woman's hair arranged like a diadem, which they valued among themselves, and it showed that the chief was a great person. Rare and valuable feather headdresses were crucial components of ritual practice throughout Polynesia. These elaborate and highly complex assemblages incorporated the potent relics of ancestors and gods, materials such as human hair and a variety of species of feathers, which enhanced the mana and status of those who wore them. In ritual contexts, they instantiated principles of personal efficacy and prestige that aimed at effecting transformation. In the political arena, they were a visual display of a leader's ability to control and maintain extensive chains of reciprocal obligations across island networks. I'm going to walk you through a selection of spectacular Central Polynesian feather headdresses recently discovered in European museum collections, and with an eye on Sean's Frontier Shores exhibition, consider ways in which these complex artifacts played into pre-colonial networks of exchange and the manufacture of identity in 18th century Polynesia. And I want to consider the challenges of continued scholarly efforts to neatly delineate geographical provenances for this single genre of artifact, headdresses, and see how we might expand our understanding of the region, given that these things moved through and across very fluid boundaries. Indeed, this inbuilt mobility is in some respects precisely what they were designed to do. Long-term dynamic interaction between islands across large distances meant that styles and techniques were in a constant state of flux. Examples of headdresses from islands in Tonga and Tahiti, which are 2,650 kilometers apart on an east-west axis, as well as this example from the Tuamotus, from the island Anaa, and a further two from Tupuai, which is an island 700 kilometers due south of Tahiti in the Austral Islands, will help us understand the ways in which this interaction played out long before the arrival of Europeans to the region. So I'm going to show you works from Western Polynesia, Tonga, a single headdress. Then we move across due east to Tahiti, right in the center of the Polynesian triangle. And then I'll allude to the Tuamotus, which is an archipelago to the northeast of Tahiti, and then Tupuai, which is directly south of Tahiti. I haven't got a map, just thought I'd set that up for you. The research I'm revisiting is based on a body of research that I began as a research fellow on the European Research Council funded project, Pacific Presences, Oceanic Art in European Museums. It's based at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge University, and it's coordinated by the museum's director, Nicholas Thomas. The project is ongoing, and despite my move to New York here, I'm still very much invested in aspects of the project and its various outcomes. But the methodological framework of the research is worth touching on briefly, since it continues to guide a lot of the work I, or we as Pacific scholars, do. As a research team, we were engaged in making multiple visits to museums across Europe, as well as collections of ethnography from the Pacific in England and Scotland. We visited museums in France, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, Estonia, and Russia, looking at Pacific material on display and in the stores, taking dimensions and photographs, logging details of all important labels, which can be matched with registers and inventories to track the various and complex trajectories of artifacts from the Pacific to Europe from the late 18th century onwards. A major aim is to encourage collaborative research with Pacific artists, cultural practitioners, and scholars in the region, to tie up an all too often disjointed dialogue between museum curators in Europe and expert knowledge and practice on the ground back in the Pacific. Digital photography is one way to enable access, and inviting Pacific scholars and specialists to travel to Europe to visit museums with us was another. A focus on materiality has very much been the guiding principle of this research, directing all aspects of engagement with the collections. And we were constantly prompted to consider, what do these things look like and why? What does the technology of manufacture reveal about the function of things? What is it that these things were designed to do on a practical level or on a cosmological level? Sometimes they're the same thing, often they're the same thing. And what kinds of materials have been incorporated into a whole? If feathers, which species of bird? Why hair? What kind of shell? What is this European fabric? When did that first come into the region? In this way, we've been able to begin to fix certain coordinates in the material record and use singular artifacts as anchor points for comparison. In many cases, the works under investigation are the only extant primary source from the Pacific side of the encounter. In a material sense, I'm not talking about oral traditions and histories, but the material thing in front of you. And therefore, we rely upon them enormously in and of themselves to help us unpick aspects of the entangled history unfolding between Europeans and Pacific Islanders from the late 18th century onwards. For my part, I have become particularly interested in the way in which a close analysis of materiality can draw out these often eclipsed cosmological aspects, which have tended to become distorted or indeed completely lost in the historical and museological record along the way. So I'm going to set up the problem. I start with the story of an early visit in 2012 to the Museo de América in Madrid, where I was looking for collections likely made by Alejandro Malaspina, who led an extensive multi-vessel expedition to the Pacific on behalf of the King of Spain. During my stay in Madrid, conservators used the opportunity of my visit to bring out certain anomalies in the collection, mystery objects that could not be easily identified. The museum itself has a remit to engage audiences with the history of Spain's colonial territories in the Americas, hence its name, the Museo de América. And the fairly contained Pacific collection they do have has been integrated into a display which emulates the Royal Library and Cabinet of the Spanish king, whose representatives in the viceroyalties of Peru and Mexico, or New Spain, were coordinating voyages to the Pacific from the Americas. So the expertise of the curatorial team and conservation at the museum understandably relates mostly to their collections of pre-Columbian and Spanish colonial works, and they are keen to elicit the knowledge of Pacific scholars when they can. One work had rather enigmatic description in the file, an apron or skirt, from the Philippines, A stiff frame of aerial roots had been bent into a crescent shape, over which were laid wrapped bundles of light wooden rods. At each end were secured twisted bolts of bark cloth, very fragile, which appeared to have been used to fasten or secure the so-called apron when worn. Nevertheless, such a rigid frame, which was not malleable at all, seemed odd for something intended to be worn around the waist. Spinning the work around on the frame it was attached to, I looked closely at these sections of lightweight wooden rods. Gathered into tight bundles, they were wrapped in dark sections of bark cloth. Looking closely, I noticed the remains of short red feathers tucked neatly into the bindings, this neatly wrapped diagonal bindings of the bark cloth. And the bark cloth was distinctive, the inky black dye of ngatu uli, produced in Tonga, a signifier of value. Peering in further, I noticed the outer exposed section of the wrapped rods had the distinctive long black quills edged with white tufts of feather, somewhat gnarled with age, but nevertheless distinctive of the tail feather of the tropic bird, or tawaki. These details are all diagnostic features of the earliest extant Tongan artifacts and play into the important three-way colour frame of black, ngatu uli, the red, feathers tucked into the strips of the cloth, and white in the tropic bird feathers. These feathers are valuable because each tropic bird has simply two tail feathers. It was clear that originally the piece would have incorporated an entire swathe extending across this arched crescent. Cut sections of coconut shell and white tridacna or clamshell were strung along the outer rim, and it was this final conclusive diagnostic feature, so typical of important Tongan artifacts, that convinced me that what we were looking at was not an apron or a skirt from the Philippines, but in fact a headdress from Tonga, likely very valuable, and possibly a pair work to just the single known palatavake in the world, which is in the Vienna Museum, formerly the Museum Volkenkunde, but now it's called the Weltmuseum in Austria. Known as palatavake, after the rare and elusive birds whose tail feathers were incorporated into the outer rim, the late 18th century Journal of the British captain James Cook described the instance when one of these important artifacts had been presented to him. Indeed, John Webber, artist on board Cook's third voyage to the Pacific, had recorded the occasion with a drawing which became a popular engraving back in England, which showed Paulaho, the highest-ranking chief or Tui Tonga, wearing such a headdress. And here's Maria Carmen, or Mamen, the chief conservator at the museum, holding up the said image that someone had immediately rushed off to print. The arrival of Europeans to Tonga had kick-started, or Vava'u specifically, had kick-started deep-seated rivalries between chiefly families in the archipelago. The high caliber and profile of items acquired during Cook's brief visit make it highly likely that the gifts bestowed upon captain and crew were a strategic attempt by Tongan chiefs to secure rights to recruit and provision the European boats with water and supplies. These newly arrived visitors were powerful agents and Tongan chiefs vied for the opportunity to integrate them into their exchange networks of reciprocal obligations. Knowing that Spanish explorer Alejandro Malaspina had visited Vava'u in the northern archipelago within months of Cook's visit, it was entirely possible that the headdress in front of us could indeed have been presented to the Spanish explorer at that time. And indeed, there is a 30-meter ngatu, or bark cloth, from Tonga in the collection with a Malaspina label on the back of it. So that's certain. There are securely provenance Malaspina works in the collection. Comparing the headdress alongside a copy of the well-known engraved image of Paulaho, we discovered the formal similarities between the two, identifying those elements that seemed consistent with the image and those details that seemed to depart from it in what may well have been artistic license or the work of an artist drawing later from memory or finishing up the detail of a more rapid sketch in the field. Certainly it appeared that the twisted lengths of bark cloth at each end of the arched base of the headdress could well have been used to secure the headdress onto the head to create this dramatic crest. This would have fanned out above the forehead of the wearer, enhancing his physical stature and presence. Whilst there were now only remnants of red feathers, it was easy to see in the engraving where different colours of feathers may once have been arranged to create alternate strips of colour and texture. Ever since the important exhibition and catalogue of Cook Voyage artefacts, known as Artificial Curiosities, organised in 1974 by Adrian Kepler and colleagues, it has been assumed that the headdress associated with the Paulaho engraving is the one that features in the collection of the Welt Museum in Vienna, here pictured. Pulling up online photos in the lab, we were able to take a closer look at the Vienna example, this the only headdress of its kind, which had been claimed for Tonga because of the extensive red feathers that are laid into the surface of the cap in strips of alternate red and green, and the fringe of red feathers here on the external rim that attached to its outer crescent. Yet it was immediately clear that there were significant differences between the two. One element that simply did not fit was the fact that the feathered cap or helmet stands detached away from the main body of the crescent-shaped fan, a feature that was nowhere alluded to in the detail of the engraved image. So soon after the discovery in Madrid, we decided to fast-track a trip to Vienna as soon as possible to see the alleged Tongan feather headdress and dig a little deeper into what was becoming a fascinating story. There we scrutinised again the Weber image of the incumbent chief, Tui Tonga, known to the Europeans as Paulaho, alongside the headdress itself. And here we are deep in discussion with colleagues Billy Lithberg, Gabriela Weiss, the curator in the museum, and myself, debating, weighing up arguments for and against its being Tongan. And in fact, colleague Billy Lithberg here on the left then took images of our visits and shared them with Tongan community members, Noho Whakataha, in Auckland, and elicited their responses to both headdresses. Despite the temptation to confirm a Tongan provenance for this piece, in fact, the evidence against the Vienna headdress being of Tongan origin began to stack up. Having identified a number of distinctly Tongan diagnostic features in the Madrid example, it was impossible now to ignore their relative absence in the Vienna headdress. The difference in the quality of the bark cloth was a first point of departure. The Vienna example deploys this very fine, plain white tapa, as opposed to the heavier, darker ngatu uli, typically incorporated into ritually significant Tongan artifacts. And here there were no finely cut shell beads or coconut beads, discs woven into its structure. It was not even certain whether this one here incorporated any tropic bird tail feathers, a particularly crucial detail given the strong association with the tawake, or tropic bird feathers, which actually give the headdress its name. Indeed, we were presented with a unique artifact comprised of this tapa and feather-bound cap or helmet, behind which a series of upright struts fan out dramatically in a crescent-shaped projection. This, along with the intricate layering of small green and red feathers which cover its exterior surface, make for a remarkably striking piece of headgear. Lined inside and out with the fine white tapa, this cone-shaped helmet was covered with carefully placed red and green feathers, and these were secured with fibre bindings into small clusters tucked into lengths of fibre which ran around the circumference of the helmet, forming these alternate strips of green and red. The fan-shaped feature is an intricate affair, concealing a structure in which 29 lightweight palm frond uprights flare outwards from tight bindings, which are secured to the crown of the helmet. Each upright is wrapped with a flat fibre bast, probably alte or hibiscus, and sandwiched between these struts are further tightly constructed bunches of red, green, and black feathers, which arch up above to frame the head of the wearer. Only one of the fibre cords which would formerly have fastened the helmet around the chin now remain. This koa cord, sinnet coconut fibre cord, passes through a hole and is secured with a small toggle. Here's this toggle. Covered in white tapa with remnants of red and green feathers that flare out to the side. Now, this toggle became a significant element in a theory that began to coalesce in my mind, that this Vienna headdress, that had for several decades instantiated the archetype of the palatavake, Tongan feather headdress, genre, may in fact have come from a group of islands over 2,500 kilometres further east in the heart of central Polynesia. So one of the most striking diagnostic features in this regard is the helmet itself. So this is a view of the other side of the headdress. Close inspection revealed that only red feathers were incorporated into the surface of this side of the helmet, not green and red in the alternate strips. And you can see here that the rim flares out at the border. This is actually the back, though we wondered if it was a peak cap, but I think it was flaring at the back, protect the back of the neck. And this feature, this flared rim, appears only on this side, and it's reinforced by a length of aerial root around this, edge, which helps keep its shape. And in his written description of the palatavake encountered during the third voyage, Cook is clear to highlight the fact that Tongan headdresses lacked any sort of crown, explaining they are made so to tie upon the forehead without any crown to give the form of a semicircle. So we're left with a bit of a conundrum. That fits the example, the description. That description fits the Madrid example better than this one. So if the Madrid example is essentially a series of feathered struts secured like a headband, here the ties tied back behind the face, the formal structure of the Vienna example is starkly different with this helmet here. The coconut fibre helmet is in fact very much in keeping with known examples of Austral Island headdresses, and more specifically those that derive from a particular island in the group of 5 islands in the Australs known as Tupuai. And in his Arts and Crafts of the Cook Islands, which features artefacts from across central Polynesia and actually includes Austral Islands because it used to lump everything together, now we're getting a more textured account of different island groups within what we call the Cook Islands. We can pull out what's Tahiti, what's the Cook Islands, what's Australs, and now actually it's exciting. We're getting down to even more firm coordinates for single islands within those groups. So as we just push through and find more works and collections, really more, we're able to plot out the stylistic features with more ease. So in his Arts and Crafts of the Cook Islands, Maori ethnographer Te Rangihiroa identified the coiling technique of these reinforced helmets as a diagnostic feature confined to the Cook and Australs, and qualified this further by insisting that none of the Cook Island headdresses has any form of tapa lining, all of which bolsters an argument for an Austral Island provenance for this Vienna headdress. So I want to show you these 2 headdresses in the British Museum, collected by the conchologist Hugh Cuming, who did a tour of Tahiti and her surrounding islands, including Tupuai and the Tuamotus, in 1826. And these really back up the argument further. This is one of the 2 headdresses now housed with the rest of Cuming's collection in the British Museum in London. And I've examined both closely, and each helmet is wrapped in a plain white bark cloth and features a small white tupper-lined toggle to each side. I think that's probably there. This bark cloth also simply tucks up underneath into the sides of the interior of this conical-shaped helmet. And when peeled back, it reveals an interior structure comprised of this coiling technique typical of austral headdresses and described and drawn in detail by Te Rangihiroa in his survey of this arts of this region. This is an example of it. You can see that these loop up over each section. This is how you have to actually hold it up and then just try and squeeze your camera and torch so you can see the underneath. James Morrison, boatswain's mate on the infamous HMS Bounty, captained by Bligh, described warriors in Tupuai preparing for war by wearing a cap made of the feathers, and I quote, of the coconut wrought after the manner of a beehive, covered with white cloth, and on the top a bunch of black feathers from the man of war bird. He continued, when they are accoutred for war, for increased spiritual armature, he explains that they bind a piece of red cloth or matting round their waist with a sash made of the fibres of the coconut plaited into sennet, at each end of which hangs a tassel of the same. Further descriptions reveal the range of design in headgear which were visually spectacular as well as strong and could withstand the concerted efforts of an attack. I quote, some of these caps have a pearl shell on the front with a semicircle of feathers from the wild duck's wings around it, but these are more for show than use. But the others will resist a severe blow, and a cutlass will make no impression on them. So this is a superb example of this interior coil technique, also collected by Hugh Cuming in Tupuai. And it shows the way in which this extended length of coconut fibre cord makes a number of turns around, I've already shown you this, but around this coil element. So you make the coil and then you kind of bind it at spaced intervals. And when compared, the interior of the Vienna headdress is exactly the same as this example from Tupuai. So we know that that's austral. Bear with me. You'll be experts in this by the end. A further crucial diagnostic feature are the unusual toggles to either side of the helmet, which secure this fastening cord for the chin support, disguising a knot and preventing the cord from slipping through. And so you'll recall that the Vienna headdress retained just one of these toggles to the left-hand side as worn, which is similar but not identical since it retained a number of green and red feathers. This example seemed never to have had feather attachments, but it remains a singular and distinctive feature that aligns it even further with the Tupuai headdress. And finally, I wanted to just briefly address the incorporation of these alternate layers of red and green feathers into artifacts from the region, the australs that is. Incredibly difficult to come by. The feathers are from the Vini ura or Vini kul, a lorikeet native to the region. They're extremely rare and valuable and were a major form of currency for islanders in the region, given that the species was confined to a single island in the group of 5, Rimatara, which is at the western end of the archipelago. 2 known examples of these unique feather crescents are extant in collections. One is in the university in Cambridge, the museum in Cambridge. This is the one I'm showing here. And it's associated with George Bennett, who visited Polynesia between 1821 and 24 as part of the London Missionary Society deputation to the region to check up on the progress of the mission. The green and red feathers are attached, they're held in place by narrow, thin strips of fibre bast, similar to those used to secure the feathers on the upright struts of the Vienna headdress. And these are then bound into a tupper-lined, there's the tupper peeping through, coconut fibre base. So this feather gorget is recorded as having a Cook Islands origin, but a similar one in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh has a firm Austral Islands provenance. And an early university collection number in Edinburgh gives an indication that it came into those museum collections in the early 1820s, when much of this material was being collected by London missionaries and brought to England, followed following a period of heightened evangelical activity in the region. What happens is that once Pomare decides to convert in Tahiti, a lot of the other chiefs and priests who support those chiefs follow suit. And then those native, as they're called, deacons, who are trained up in the mission, then move out to the outer islands, including the Australs. And a lot of these works start coming out of Tahiti and the surrounding islands in this precise era, 1820s. And one last London Missionary Society example. I mean, this is a Polynesian to'o, which means a baton or support, collected some 20 years after the initial settlement of London missionaries to Tahiti in 1797. So at just under 40 centimetres, it's designed to be held in the hand and comprises a central core of this thick plaited coconut fibre cord, which in similar fashion to the headdresses we've seen, is bound with this fine white bark cloth and capped at one end here with the rare and distinctive vinicule red and green feathers. The gods were encouraged to inhabit these kinds of images, which functioned as vessels during ritual interactions. And it's specifically the material armature of these gods, or to'o, the feathers, the coconut fibre work, that encourages the gods to temporarily inhabit these images. It's a technology of enchantment. It's a way to capture the potency of gods to be present during your engagement with them in a ritual, sacred precinct or marae. In his extensive analysis of every genre of Polynesian art, which appeared in serial forms as the arts and crafts of the various islands, the Māori ethnographer Te Rangihiroa identified strips of the green and red feathers as very much in keeping with a specifically Austral Island aesthetic. And he was able to comment on feathered headdresses in particular, which he pointed out were ornamented with bunches of beautiful red and green feathers, tastefully arranged, and sometimes configured in horizontal bars. The scholarly efforts of early Pacific ethnographers such as Hiroa to secure stylistic and technical coordinates for a range of artifacts within these specific island groups has been an incredibly important contribution to the analysis of style and technology in the arts of Polynesia. Diligent and meticulous, the objective was to seek out clear stylistic parameters that help our continued incursions into establishing precisely where things are from. Yet, as we have seen, the storerooms of European museums continue to offer up their secrets, and further unique examples of the feather headdress continue to emerge. And it's really interesting because the headdresses are really something that hasn't really had much attention in the discipline of the arts of this region. And a colleague working with the Smithsonian collections in Washington has turned up 2 Fiji feather headdresses, again with these, interestingly, another big crescent shape with these fanned sections of lightweight wood which are wrapped. And it's been, actually bundled up. She's managed to unpack it and take photos of it actually fanning out. So she's working with conservation. So we're really going to pull that work into this research. So we have a Tongan one now. We could have 2 examples of Fiji. They're actually Wilkes' collection, founding collection of the Smithsonian Institute, because they're, the collections he made in Fiji are significant. So this will add further detail to our analysis of the Tongan headdress in Madrid and then help us kind of map out the rest. These additions complicate a corpus which is far from static, but continues to expand as one-off, apparently singular examples of feather headdresses come to light. These discoveries texture the earlier attempts of ethnographers to box up the art of particular island groups into neat classificatory systems. Spectacular feather headdresses defy easy categorization and remind us of the necessarily fluid boundaries between island archipelagos, where people, ideas, and things are in constant and dynamic interaction. My sense is that we are moving into an era in which it is becoming more productive, when this is possible, to think about the art of individual islands and the complex set of interactions unique to each. In this case study, the evidence would seem to weigh in defense of an Austral island, likely Tupuai or Rimatara provenance, for the headdress in Vienna. Incredibly, the appearance on the scene of just one new and singular artifact in Madrid just 4 years ago has deeply unsettled a line that had once seemed so robust and steady. Suddenly, something which had been so insistently Tongan for decades has been uprooted and is leading us into newly configured terrain. And I mention this because there have been energetic reactions from different sectors of the Tongan community in New Zealand, with whom we have shared these finds, at the suggestion that the Vienna headdress may not, after all, be Tongan. So despite the appearance of a more likely candidate in the Midge collection, claims by descendants of the lineage that continue to have the rights to make palatavake contest the suggestion. So it's really opened up this very interesting dialogue with community of Tongans, cultural practitioners, artists, and scholars, which is great. You know, we're kind of getting into a kind of more close-grained dialogue with people about the possibilities. Whilst the formal qualities of these fusion works are fascinating, perhaps we miss the point when we insist on the specificities of style and design and attempt to track these meticulously. The sheer variety and expressive diversity of the headdresses that evolved over time in different island groups across Polynesia is largely due to the fact that the imperative was never that something should look like something in particular. In fact, each instantiation is rather an interpretation of an established template that aims to harness and enhance spiritual efficacy in the wearer. Vital ingredients in this regard were feathers, since they underscored the direct descent line of the chiefs that wore them and linked them to gods. When these islands first coalesce into existence, and I'll use Tahiti as an example in this particular case, this is a wonderful parai, part of the mourner's costume ensemble, but this is actually pearl shell and turtle shell. These are the goggles, so they usually have one slit on the left eye, and this one has got these cut sections. That's, again, it's actually, interestingly, these two are not turtle shell, though they're black pearl shell, which has been kind of polished to emulate turtle shell. And then this is another cut section of pearl shell. And then this huge, like this is in such pristine condition. And they're actually, when you get up close, you can see the red tip of the tropic bird tail feather. So you get either the white, or when you have the red, it's really very distinctive. And this is in really great condition. So when these islands first coalesced into existence, the bird-like creator god Ta'aroa was understood to have pecked his way through the shell dome in which he was encased. Shedding feathers from his body, these drop to the ground and become the trees, the plants, the rivers, the physical landscape of the islands. So feathers are charged quite literally with the potency of Tepor, the dark realm in which God's spirits and ancestors reside. They did not represent or symbolize divinity. They're literal instantiations of it. So they have this efficacy in them because they relate to that first moment of creation, the cosmogony of the islands themselves. So if the red-tipped tail feathers of the tropic bird reached high into the sky, the feather bindings, which you see throughout this piece, and then in these, toggles here to attach to the back of the head, it's the fiber bindings that create a network connectivity with Tane, whose domain is the forest and the land, and then the lustrous shine of the pearl shell brings together the three domains of land, sea, and sky. Now, luminosity is also a key factor in creating the appropriate conditions for efficacy. The luster and brilliance of polished pearl shell was alluded to in the indigenous name for this headpiece, or parai. The parai actually infers a state of temporary blindness. So there's this sense of this spectacular bewilderment, and it's certainly one of the transformative ambitions behind the design of this impressive headdress, which is one of my personal favorites. The incorporation of feathers into headdresses was therefore a strategic and fundamental aspect of their transformative potential. Understanding how and why specific materials were used to create these highly complex assemblages helps us get closer to understanding the precise ideological investments 18th century and earlier islanders were making in these important artifacts. Gods were said to inhabit the bodies of birds during contact with humans, and specific trees were planted within sacred precincts to encourage and ensure the arrival of appropriate birds to ritual enactments. And the birds were called, they're termed atta, which are shadows or embodiments of gods. And the noise and chatter of specific birds in these trees was deemed to be auspicious, a sure sign that the gods were present. In binding their heads with the armature of feathers, Polynesian chiefs visually announced their legitimacy to rule, asserting divine right, if you will, and created conditions appropriate for the material activation of things. I'll finish with this incredible image that's in the Bishop Museum archives in Hawaii. And this is a work which provides a crucial piece of the cosmological puzzle. Cosmological, I said. Siri doesn't like that word. Asked by an early missionary to express in drawing his understanding of the creation of the world and the ancient chants that related to it, Paiore, who was from one of the Tuamotu Islands, laid out the visual relationship that linked the complementary domains of land, sea, and sky. A total of 9 canopies reach into the outer reaches of the sky. Each is named, and each has its own set of attributes. There's a wonderful small volume published in Tahiti by Edition Hairepo, which actually has the exegesis of an islander who actually analyzes this marvelous image, and he relates it to chants and oral histories from his particular family. Abundant flora and fauna populate 4 levels of ocean, both above and below sea level, and generations of man create this upright. Here, they're propping up the sky, and this is actually what God images do. The to'o is a baton or a support. So if you have this notion that this is the creation story throughout these islands about there being total darkness, and actually what happens is that the sky at some stage is pushed up and creates the canopy. In our case, I said about Tangaroa turns that eggshell over, creates the dome of the sky. But actually consistent in all the accounts of the fact that, tangata, the man is this in this vertical plane, rather like the upright tropic bird feathers, but that horizontal plane refers more to this domain expressed in the crescent shape. So yes, generations of man create this upright vertical chain, which is abstracted to a simple zigzag motif in places, and that's a trope that you often find emulated in the lashing techniques and all the carving styles in artifacts. So not for nothing does this visual representation of the cosmological universe by Paiore remind us of the distinctive arched and crescent-shaped feather headdresses examined in this paper. Framing the face and head of chiefly power with light and vigor, feather headdresses were designed to channel energy and reinforce the full potential of individual leaders. Far from static artifacts, headdresses played a key role as a cosmological technology of sorts, deployed to manage and control always uncertain transitions across thresholds, most notably the tapu and highly charged boundary between the human and divine elements outlined in this image. So I'd like to finish just by flashing up this quote in a final slide. This was published recently in Apollo, the international art magazine, and Nicholas Thomas reminds us of the continued vitality of the ethnography collections we care for in museums. Ethnography collections need to be living collections, representative of cultural diversity in the present, as well as of traditions which suffered upheaval and the confrontation of empire. Renewed museums have the capacity to represent not only world cultures, but also the interconnectedness of the world. So I think this is really playing into your exhibition upstairs, starting with the puzzling and sometimes problematic stories of how these collections reach museums. Conceived ambitiously rather than apologetically, museums of ethnography and world cultures now have more to offer than ever before. So expanding upon the ideas that Sean has explored so successfully in his Frontier Shores exhibition, I hope I've suggested that just as different populations became entwined in relationships of exchange and power when European empires expanded in the Pacific world, clues to the way in which cultural exchange was realized materially prior to that incursion are embedded in the vital and varied artifacts we continue to discover in museum stores. Thank you very much.
We have a short amount of time for some questions before coffee break. Do we have any volunteers? I have one quick question, actually.
Yeah.
You were talking about the tour before with the tongue and the possession of the object because of the feathers and the manufacture by these god beings. So do you know...
Well, not by the god beings, but by the people who want to connect with them.
Sure,
Yeah.
Thank you for the correction. So do you know, with the introduction of Christianity to the region, how did this impact both the spiritual and material aspects of these objects?
Well, it's really interesting because...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. So with the object...
The missionary encounter.
Yeah, basically the missionary encounter, the introduction of Christianity to the region, how did this spiritually and materially impact the translation of these objects and the belief that they could be communed with the gods?
Well, it's actually interesting that when I was researching this for my PhD, I really had the sense that, I mean, it is actually the priests who support the Pomare when he converts that actually drive the iconoclasm in the region. So there's a quotation, there's a citing in Teode Henry's account which talks about Pati'i in a marae Taputapuatia at Morea, just across the way, and he actually calls out for people to come down and break their gods. And so in the smashing of them and the burning of them, they're actually desacralizing them, but actually sending them back to Te Po. So, and there's another quote that talks about Pomare having to go across to Tetiaroa to settle some affairs and deal appropriately with this old order of gods. So when in Tahiti, people have come to the museum and said they found to'o figures over the years in the 20s and 30s. A few, god images were found in caves and buried or planted in the ground, but they're consistently buried head down. So they're actually being sent back to the other side. And actually, the reason that we know that is because there are precedents for replacing your ineffective gods with new ones. So that's not a new thing in Polynesia. So Teode and Henry also relates a specific chant which enables you to unwrap and unbind and take off the binding elements, and then those specific components you can actually then send away, because you don't want potent things hanging around, even if you're not believing in them, in their technology. You still don't leave them. You have to deal with them appropriately. So it's really interesting that actually that's very much driven by islanders. I mean, it's assumed that it's the London Missionary Society that insist on bagging these things up and getting them back to them, But actually what happens, the other interesting moment is that Williams is described as coming to Raiatea with the gods that have just been given up to him, strung up in the yard arms of the vessel. And actually that's a very Polynesian way to display your trophies. So actually that's what you do with enemies. When you return to the battlefield and you take the jawbones of your slain enemies and then you hang them up. So as well as the gods, which are described as being strung up in the yard arms of the vessel as they come into what was the headquarters at Raiatea for the London Mission, there are jawbones and Polynesian, kind of artifacts displayed along with all their gods. So they're surrendering these idols to the mission. And what they do is they have this big ceremony at night where they actually pull, this is where A'a comes into play, this enormously important Austral Rurutuan sculpture at the British Museum, and he's opened, the back door of that kind of reliquary is opened, and they pull out these to'o fly whisks and spear point heads, and they publicly denounce their gods. So they have this, and they talk about the ephemerality of the gods as laid bare. So basically, they kind of cast them out. Yeah, but that's very much driven by the islanders. I mean, that was really a big thrust of the PhD, was to kind of restore the agency of islanders in that moment, in that missionary encounter, and just really complicate it. It's not kind of black and white.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
there is,
Thank you. We have time probably for one more question, if anyone has one in the audience. Jim?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Maia. That resplendent paper. It was fascinating, and thanks for sharing all that with us. So I was thinking, you've been talking a little bit about exhibitions you'd like to have at the Met, and thinking about some of these themes, I know.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about that, and also about what contemporary Tongans and Marutans, others in the Austral Islands, perhaps might be doing as part of cultural revival movements that are going on, that might be recapturing some of the senses of importance of rapping, or any of those kinds of...
Yeah, I mean, I would like to do a show which really addresses that, the light, really, actually, and talk about space and light out there, and actually just focus in on this very, indigenous, just look like an idea that's crucial, and just show how works of art kind of play into that. In Rurutu, art has become such a celebrity. It's like, and actually, they've just, our colleague Julie Adams has just collaborated with people on the island who actually look after the marae where A'a was, originally from, and they have sent back, information to her for her to incorporate into that display. Yeah.
There are many contemporary artists doing sort of interesting new departures, or anything using feathers or wrapping or any of those things, or is it feeling like that's really quite a past practice that perhaps hasn't been reclaimed?
I don't really, the contemporary art in French Polynesia is, it's different. I mean, as you know, it's different throughout the regions, but it's in a different kind of mode, I think, when we're visiting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Maia, that was excellent.